Hello, everybody. If you're watching live, as always, please feel free to ask any questions along the way. If you think you might like to join me, come on the show yourself, please do get in contact. My details on the channel's About page. There's going to be no show for the next couple of weeks. Probably 10th of January is when I'll be back. But today's guest is Sylvain Munaut, aka TNT. Hello, hello.
Hey, hi, Ati.
How are you
Thanks
doing?
for very good. Thanks for having me.
Good. No problem. Would you like to introduce yourself quickly? Just say who you are and what you
Yeah,
do.
sure. So I'm Sylvain, and uh, I do mostly FPGA stuff. I think
Okay.
that's what a lot of people nowadays know me for, um, and I guess we'll talk about some of them.
Yeah, absolutely. Dare I ask where the nickname TNT came from? Not the logistics company, presumably.
No. It comes from me as a kid. Liking to make things go boom.
Okay.
Uh, so there you go. My mom being a science teacher had access to lots of chemicals and stuff like
Mhm.
that. So, and at the time, at least, you weren't risking, going to prison or anything like that by doing your own kind of stuff. So
Okay,
there you
fair
go.
enough.
That's where it comes from.
That's a great lead into to talk about your childhood then. So, as you said, your mum's a science teacher. Can you just fill us in about how things were for you back then?
Yeah, so my mom was a science teacher, and my dad was a electronics enthusiast and hobbyist.
Mhm.
So that means that I got interested like in all things science and computers and electronics fairly early on because like I would read my mom's book and she was teaching high school and I was like in primary school and I was already reading that kind of stuff. She sometimes would take me to class because when you're in primary school you have more vacation days and stuff like that.
Okay.
So not having a nanny, I would just basically be uh, in the class and doing the same exercises as the high school student, that kind of stuff. And that's for like the chemical part of things. And for electronics, it's mostly comes from my dad. Just him hanging out, me hanging out with him in his little workshop while he was working with either building electronics kits, the whole Heath kit stuff from I think the 70s and 80s
Mhm.
kind of stuff. And he was also doing like a lot of design himself. One of the most like vivid memories I have of the design he was doing. What was like a automatic control of train sets. Like he had some very elaborate train sets
Mhm.
with lights, switches, and stuff like that, and all controlled by entirely several cards of 74,000 logics.
Amazing.
Which yeah, at the time I had no idea what it was. I only found out
Yeah.
what these kind of things were way after. But yeah, that's definitely what got me started in electronics. And then
Mhm.
a few years later, computers came. He bought the family a Tandy 1000 HX, I think, which was a
Okay.
8086
Mhm.
computer. And obviously we had some games and stuff like that, but a lot of the stuff we were doing was we're transcribing basic program from huge books and just typing them in.
Did I copy
Not
it down
necessarily.
wrong, or is there a bug in the book kind of stuff?
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And then also, you couldn't always understand what they were doing because a bunch of the thing would be written in BASIC, but then you had a bunch of data and peek and poke commands, that were
Okay.
addressing the memory directly, and you had no idea what it was doing.
Mystery.
Yeah. And then a few years later, moved on to C and more complicated things, basically.
Okay.
But yeah.
You say a few years later, but we're talking about your childhood, so that was quite young. You
Yeah,
started
yeah. I
getting
mean,
into C.
I was still in. It was still on the 8086, or
Okay.
slightly later on, like a couple of years later, on 8286.
Okay.
But yeah, it's still like I don't know. I have no idea. I was still in middle of the primary school in Belgium, which I guess would be I don't know, like 8 years old or something.
Okay. Very good.
I honestly I'm kind of fuzzy with dates because I'm just don't remember that much. But
No, that's fair enough. I'm terrible as well, so don't worry. Very cool. So yeah, you got Tandy and you started from a young age. You got into C. I think at then some point you started using Linux and things as well. Can you sort of fill us in a bit on that?
Yeah, so I started Linux kind of late. I started using Linux when I went to university.
Okay.
A little before that, I was actually using OS2 Warp,
Okay.
which was kind of a weird choice. And I got started in OS2 Warp because I started playing with FidoNet, which was like a sort of a news group thing where you exchange message with modem connection just before the internet and stuff like that. And I was running my own node and stuff like that. And some of the guy introduced me to OS2 Warp and stuff like that. But when I got to university, I started. So it's when I started studying for my master in computer science. Some of the exercises were in Linux. And the computer room we had access to were also running Linux. And so that's where I really got started with Linux is at university.
Okay. And how was the decision to do computer science at uni for you? Was that sort of a logical, made sense, and you wanted to?
I think at the time, yeah, it's because I was doing more computer things at the time. I kind of evolved toward that. I still very much liked electronics, but I wanted something that had a little bit of everything. And so the exact thing I studied here is called like civil engineer, basically, but with a specialization in computer science. And that allowed me to have like a bunch of actual science courses, like thermodynamics, chemistry, that kind of stuff. I could also select in my optional courses things related to electronics and things like that, but also computer science, kind of have a mix of all the things I liked, basically.
Yeah, awesome.
Yeah.
Okay. And so how did that course go? You said it was masters and progressed easily and enjoyed it?
I ended up finishing my master in computer science, and due to some reform, like the whole Bologna transition, which happened the year just behind me, and the fact that I procrastinated registering for some course, I just discovered, I wanted to do some additional work in electrical engineering. Like at the time, there was like a 1-year course that you could do after with basically more electrical engineering course. Turned out that was suppressed, and I ended up just starting a second master in in electrical engineering.
Okay.
Which I should have been able to complete in 2 years. But during the first additional year that I did, one of the things I did was a group project that obviously involves several person, hence group, which introduced me to FPGAs.
Okay.
So the goal of the project was like a Wi-Fi controlled robot that you could control via Wi-Fi. They provided us with like one of those Wi-Fi to serial module because it was 2004 or something like that. So no ESP32 or anything like that.
Wi-Fi was new and exciting, but serial was easy to deal with. Yeah.
They just started basically Wi-Fi at the university.
Okay.
And so they were trying to play with that, and you get a telnet port, you telnet to it, and you get on the other hand a UART. And so our goal was to control something remotely with that, and also have some video links so that you could actually see where you're going and stuff like that.
Okay.
Now, in the division of task, I ended up working on the video part. Mostly because of my interest in digital design, but also because of a few years prior to that, I actually had to reverse engineer and implement a driver for my webcam so that it would run under Linux, which means I had some knowledge of some compression algorithm, and especially some simple compression algorithm. It was actually called JPEG Lite, which is like a simplified version of JPEG. And that's basically what I ended up implementing for that group project. Is like a FPGA implementation of that compression algorithm.
So on this Wi-Fi robot was an FPGA as well as whatever control systems
so
were being
we
used.
had to do everything. So, it was a collaboration between electrical engineering students and mechanical students and computer science students. Some of them would do the control software on the PC. Some would be designing the mechanicals and the motor and stuff like that. Some of the electronics engineer would be designing, the battery system and the motor driver. And I ended up doing the camera and the FPGA code that was running there.
Yeah, very good. Yeah. And you got it working?
Yeah, it was really an interesting project.
Yeah, nice.
And in retrospect, it actually did, I think, influence a lot where I ended up.
Okay.
And to today, because after that project was completed, I had the year was ending, and I had to pick the subject for my upcoming master thesis in electrical engineering. And I was approached by the teaching assistant from that project because they were actually creating a company that's what they were basically trying to implement a JPEG 2000 decoder on FPGA targeting digital cinema projectors.
Okay. Yeah.
And they saw the result of my project and what I worked on, and they offered me, okay, like, do you want to do an internship with us as your master thesis, and you're gonna be implementing part of that JPEG 2000 decoder. I ended up not doing an internship. I ended up not finishing my second master because I figured, okay, I already got one master. I might as well get paid.
I don't need two.
Yeah, I might as well get paid to implement it, and so I actually went to work for them in their startup.
And so this was straight out of uni, inverted commas, but really,
I mean, I was actually still
halfway through the relevant course.
I accepted that.
Yeah.
I had everything planned to still be at uni, which I was actually still, for 1 year, I was still staying in student lodgement because I had already booked for the year and reserved the room and stuff. So
nice.
Yeah. But they were based in the same city as the university because it's UCL is a university city basically. Half campus, half thing.
Okay. And you went straight to implementing, as you say, JPEG 2000 on an FPGA, professionally speaking. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think I implemented probably half to 2/3 of that core in like the actual functional blocks because doing actual implementation work was me and one other guy, which was one of the founder and the node CTO of the company. And they had found basically a very smart way of doing the first part of the decoding process of JPEG 2000, which is the entropic decoding, which is notoriously hard to implement efficiently in FPGA or in parallel. Basically, it's sort of a fundamentally serial process, which doesn't fit well on FPGA, but they had found some smart way of doing it. And that's why they basically wanted to create these companies, because they knew they had there something that nobody else had. And that would be adding a lot of value. But still, even if you have that part, you still need to implement the rest of the actual codec, right?
Interesting. Okay.
And so even in the rest, we still found some interesting and efficient way of doing things. And that product is now, mature, but it was very successful because the company still exists. It's still successful. They obviously evolved to doing other things than that, right? But it's been deployed very widely and with some very big names in the cinema industry. So I would pretty much be sure that if you've seen any movies projected on digital cinema, you have seen movie decoded by that IP core or descendant of it. But yeah,
that's awesome. Such a cool claim.
Yeah.
I was just gonna ask. So this is an IP core, as you said just now. It's IP that you sell into other companies that then implement it in their products.
Yes, it's literally so. It has an input port where you feed the raw bit stream of JPEG 2000, which is like 200 megabits of JPEG 2000 compressed data stream, and at the exit you've got the pixel stream, and the decoder was actually fast enough and consistent enough that you could, in our demo platform, we were actually connecting its output directly to an HDMI encoder with only 4 lines of buffering.
Wow. Okay.
We didn't need a frame buffer or anything like that at the output.
Yeah.
We could follow the timing of HDMI close enough that
That's amazing.
we didn't need a frame buffer, which obviously is very nice because it saves you a bunch of memory, of bandwidth, of complexity.
Yeah, absolutely.
That was really.
So I don't know much about the decoding process for JPEG or JPEG 2000, but I always presumed that you decode the image into a frame buffer, but it sounds like no.
No.
Okay.
There is 1 frame of latency, but basically you can put your buffer somewhere in the middle. But I can't
Right.
really explain more than that. And
No, that's okay.
because
That's
that
okay.
would be
NDAs
But
and all
yeah,
that.
you don't need to decompress the frame buffer.
Yeah, sure. Interesting. Very cool. So that was your work in digital cinema, I suppose.
Yes.
What did you do then after that?
So after that, I kind of moved to another company that where I was actually a co-founder of a startup. But what I ended up doing there was not necessarily very interesting and not very relevant to what I do now. It was mostly server administration and stuff like that.
Okay.
There was definitely some nice aspect and things where I learned quite a few things, mostly in networking, because it's always nice to get to play with fancy networking hardware or, inject your own BGP routes and that kind of stuff. That's always fun.
Yeah.
Toward the end, we also did some very nice deployment and hardware, because that's actually an anecdote that I really love, is that we were deploying some servers and we wanted to basically have the HDD locked with the HDD password and stuff like that. But the BIOS was just annoying in the sense that if you had the HDD locked with the password, it would prompt for it on boot. And that annoyed us because we didn't want to manually unlock them. They would be unlocked by some other process. And so we wanted to remove that. And what we ended up doing was just patching the BIOS. We found so we unpacked the UEFI BIOS, find the module that was responsible for doing that, and just bypassed the check, and then re-sign the BIOS with our own key, and then upload a new BIOS and deploy that.
Okay.
Which was definitely fun.
Fun
thing to do.
It's always amazing when you come down to the security things like that, and you find your way around them. Yeah. But very cool. Okay.
But as I said, like a lot of things that I was doing there were not necessarily the most always interesting, and so quite quickly I ended up starting doing consulting jobs on the side.
Okay.
And some of the first consulting job that I did was actually for that first digital cinema company, simply because they needed some help, like extending the cores that I had worked on, and I was the most knowledgeable person about them, even though you can write as much documentation as you want and have as much comment in the code as you want. If you're the one who wrote it, you still know more than anyone else. So that's how I got started, basically doing some contracting job.
Okay. And was that kind of they reached out to you, said we need help, and you said,
yes,
okay, I'll do it on the side, right?
Exactly. That's basically how I got started. Is because people were. I was doing a lot of, in parallel. I was doing a lot of hobby stuff and mostly in telecom things. But I was also trying to play slightly with FPGA, although not a whole lot. But at some point they came and they asked, okay, like can you help us with that? And I figured, okay, I have enough people asking me to do things that maybe I could actually, cut my hours and have like basically the equivalent of 1 day a week to go and work on side project for contracting. Yeah.
And how did that go? Is it something that the employer, your company, were okay to let you do by then?
I mean, they were fine with it because, I mean, given I was one of the founder of the company,
You have some clout, yeah.
yeah, exactly. I had some pull to force them, but honestly, if they had said no, I would have just quit.
Fair enough. I guess that's the risk from their side.
Yeah.
Okay.
So yeah, and that went pretty well. I was pretty happy with the contracting.
Okay.
The other company were also, I couldn't take necessarily all the jobs because given I was only basically available the equivalent of one day a week, I was mostly working on projects that were kind of nice to have.
Yeah.
They're not critical.
No time pressure, that kind of thing.
And there's no critical deadline and things like that, or at least no nearby deadlines. But it would be really nice to have, and if you can do it faster than any of our engineer could do it, it's still interesting for us, basically.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
And so how did that go? You carried on doing that sort of as a side thing for a while, and I think
I carried doing that for a while, like several years on and off, because sometimes I wouldn't have anything to do and I would just have a day off. That would be fine. I would just be working on my open source project or learning new things like that. But at some point, I ended up leaving that first company and looking for more contracting jobs, and thankfully I didn't actually have any trouble finding some.
Okay. It's always a leap of faith, isn't it, to take that step of
exactly,
sort of reliable employment to finding your own work. Yeah.
But I mean, even though I haven't had any trouble so far, there's also the possibility, right? Because you really don't have any guarantee, right? But it's been a good journey with its up and downs. Like one thing that I definitely miss is because most of my customers are actually outside the country, I end up I'm working alone most of the time, right? And sometimes you kind of miss having people to talk to around the water cooler or whatever. At some point, I actually considered going back and working part-time for that first company because they were missing manpower, and I wanted to have something local where I could go and find back like some colleagues. And then COVID happened. So that plan kind of got canceled, and I got started on some longer project for some other client, and so. But I'm okay now, and slowly starting to get into a rhythm and learning how to deal with contract job, because it's not always easy. The first thing is something I learned very quickly is that I bill all my contract job by the hour, because you can provide an estimate as much as you want. Things can always go wrong, and they can go very, very wrong. And I don't want to be in a position where I have to work for free for 6 months just to fulfill a contract.
Do you get a lot of pushback from potential customers for that?
Yes, that definitely does happen. But most of the time, so far, I've just tell them, okay, bye. And they always came back.
Interesting.
Because the choice is either you accept that or I just don't work for you. So
interesting.
That's just non-negotiable.
Do they push for some sort of middle ground, even where
I mean,
you might suggest provide an estimate, and any extra time past a particular threshold you charge hourly, for example? Or
I mean, that doesn't really make sense, because that would end up being just charged hourly. But the story where I learned that was thankfully with that first company with which I was on very friendly ground, and we were discussing a project. I think it was the second or third project I actually was working on, where we were discussing the requirement and the implementation plan, reading the specification and the code and stuff like that, and both me and the CTO and we're the original author of that decoding core, and we wanted to add some features to it. So we are very familiar with the code because we wrote all of it basically. We were very, very familiar with the specifications because we've read that document so many times. And still, we completely missed something that ended up, instead of being a couple of weeks of work, ended up to be 6 months of work or something, because we had to rewrite a significant part of the core. Because, when you need to change the architecture in FPGA, it's like a big refactoring in code that can take some time. And thankfully, because they were, aware that they had also missed on their side this, they were perfectly happy with paying the overtime and stuff like that. But that's where I kind of learned, okay, when I'm doing something that is not trivial and where I don't already know the answer, because, okay, for some contracts, I will accept a per contract, because that sometimes I will do, to estimate the work, I will do some pre-work, and sometimes I actually finish the entire thing in a day, right? And so at that point, I'm okay with billing them by contract, because I know exactly how much it took, because I've already done it. So
okay,
but that's
I
only
presume that tends to be the smaller things, and
exactly. It's if I need to find a bug and I've already found it by the time I give you the estimate, I'm not taking much risk, right?
Fair enough. Okay. Very good. So can you talk about some of the projects you're working on then in your consulting sort of roles at the moment?
At the moment, I do mostly telecom stuff. But for things I can't really talk about. One of the latest project that I can definitely talk about, that was an open source project that I did for Sysmocom, which is actually ICE40 USB trace, which is project I forgot to mention.
Okay.
Which is basically a project that was sponsored by a company that had a use case for the OpenVisla USB analyzer.
Yep.
Unfortunately, Spartan 6 are basically unobtainium at the moment. And so, because I have developed a lot of IP cores for the ICE40 and worked a lot with it, we realized that we could actually do something basically equivalent to the OpenVisla, at least in the full USB use case. And we could do it with an ICE40. And so we did a fully open source implementation of a USB protocol analyzer in a form factor, which is basically a drop-in for the OpenVisla. And that the result of that work is fully open source, both the gateway, firmware, and the Python host software for it. And most importantly, even though there exists a dedicated hardware for it, you can actually run it on pretty much any ICE40 board, which is really convenient, because that means if you have any ICE40 development board, all you need is 4 IOs on one port, 2 that you connect to your USB bus that you want to spy on, basically, and 2 that you connect to your host computer. Sorry, you need 5 IO because you need the actual USB pull-up as well. And so you need 4 IO and a 1.5K resistor, and then you can wire that and have a working USB full-speed analyzer.
Okay. And that sounds like it's with no fire or anything. It's just directly into.
Yeah, exactly. Because USB full speed is basically, I mean, you can actually
3.3 volt logic almost, isn't it?
3.3 volt CMOS is fine.
Yeah. Nice.
So
very cool. And so, can you just sort of expand on the commercial arrangements there? Someone wanted this, and they were happy to make it open source, and therefore.
Yeah, exactly. That's basically all I know, because I'm not the one talking to the client here.
Okay.
It's a project that was sponsored by Sysmocom, and they have some commercial contact. I'm not aware.
No, that's fair enough.
Yeah.
Okay. Very cool.
But that project actually is reusing a lot of the IP cores. That's the reason why we did it is because it was reusing a bunch of the IP cores that I've done for the Ice40, because I did that's something I do a lot in my kind of spare time, is work with the Ice40, because I just love that platform. Because it's a very small and constrained FPGA, it gives you good opportunity to try to push the limits, and which is something I really like, because if you can do it on a small FPGA, then you can do it also on larger FPGA, you know, trying to be conservative in the way you use resources. And at least in my other commercial project, even though I work with bigger FPGA, a lot of the projects I've been working on were actually adding features to products that were already deployed. So you already have hardware that's deployed in the wild with fixed FPGA that are already, you know,
physically exist.
Physically exist, and the gateway already exists and already uses a bunch of resources.
Yes,
and you need to add a bunch of features to it without replacing them, basically. And so that implies to be efficient into what you're doing, because the cost of developing and deploying new hardware would be too great, and so they prefer to spend more time being, you know, it's always a trade-off between time and the time the engineer spends and the final size of the bit stream, basically.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Okay, fascinating. So talking about the Ice40 then, and pushing its limits, I think you've got you managed to do Doom.
Yes, exactly. I think that's the first Ice40 project that kind of gained some visibility, basically, is porting Doom to the Ice40. I'm not entirely sure how I ended up doing that. I mean, like why I ended up doing that. I think it's basically, it always comes down to somebody asked the question, like, is it possible? And then I figured, you know, thinking a little bit, yeah, I think it is. Then they don't believe me, and then I don't have a choice. I kind of have to do it, right?
No, it has to be done. Yeah.
That's the best argument. If somebody doesn't believe you, is to actually do it, because then, you know, you can't
argue anymore.
Exactly.
So what was involved in that?
So I think the main obstacle with that were having a CPU that was fast enough. That wasn't written by me. That was the Vex RISC-V that already existed. But then you needed to, you know, wire it up properly and provide it in enough memory to run Doom, because, you know, Doom requires something like I think the minimum is like 4 megabyte, but I ended up giving it 8 megabyte of memory. And I used one of those SPI PSRAM chip, and could connect it basically in parallel to the flash chip, which means I didn't use many I/O. All I needed was one more chip select line, and it's connected in parallel to the flash that's already connected to the FPGA. And the next step is actually clock it fast enough, because you need to, memory bandwidth is really the big limiting factor. And so I have a bunch of logic that basically runs the memory interface at 4 times the system clock speed. Which means it's running at 100 megahertz in that case, slightly faster, like 104 megahertz. Which on that small FPGA is actually quite a challenge, which means that a lot of that logic that runs at 100 megahertz is actually manually placed. So like I'm not writing HDL. I'm basically instantiating, you know, physical block and manually telling the place and root tool, okay, you're gonna place it in exactly that cell and nowhere else.
So this is pretty onerous work, you know, intensive to get it to run at that speed. Yeah.
But thankfully, it's a very little amount of logic, because it's basically just a serializer and deserializer that takes 4 bits and outputs them serially. And does the opposite for the input, basically. And I think those were the two main challenges, that fitting CPU that's fast enough, including hardware multipliers for it, because Doom is a lot of multiplication, and have good memory subsystem, which includes fast access RAM, and also I forgot to mention, but cache, because you can get large bandwidth from that external SPI memory, but you still have a horrible latency.
Yes. Yeah.
And so you need some cache for it. Yeah.
Okay.
But
Nice.
the
And
forking and provide a decent, a playable frame rate. I would say.
and so I was just I put a link in the chat.
Yeah.
Watch that if anyone's interested. Maybe after we've had our chat. But I was just scrubbing through the video to see if there's a picture of the board and things all plugged up. Can you just describe what you ended up with? Was it a
So yeah,
small
the board that I
LCD
use is the board that I use for a lot of my ICE40 experiment.
Mm-hmm.
It's the 1 bit squared icebreaker.
Mm-hmm.
I just love that board because it has 3 P modes, which means you've got a good flexibility of I/O and external modules.
Mm-hmm.
And also there is kind of this hack that you can do where, you know, to put there is no SPI PSRAM chip by default, and I didn't want to use one of the P mods. So because it has a flash chip, what I ended up doing is basically piggybacking the SPI PSRAM on top of the flash chip, because they're pinout compatible, and just lift the CS, the chip select line, and connect it manually with a bodge wire to a free IO pin of the FPGA.
Very nice.
And that provides me the memory. I think then 2 of the P mods are connected to an HDMI encoder chip for the video outputs. I don't remember what the 3rd P mod is used for. I actually think it's not used for anything.
I was just scrolling through. I've got a picture of your
exactly that
PSRAM.
exactly.
Yeah.
That's the piggybacking. Like it was on the first revision of the board, it wasn't actually an option, but then Peter actually added like a dedicated pad for it next to it, so that you could do the mod easily if you wanted to.
Nice.
Yeah, like
is that
like
down here?
RAM chip select pad that was added, that if you want to do that mod, you can. It's kind of officially supported.
Hey. That's awesome. Very cool. Okay, so this was all running in the FPGA with HDMI output to a screen at sort of 640 by 480 kind of resolution, was it?
Yeah, so it's a 640 by 480, like the video resolution that's output on HDMI, but the native resolution of the game is only 320 by 200, and this gets expanded to this when doing the actual HDMI output.
No, well done. That's a pretty impressive feat. Did you get much good response from the community and things?
Yeah. I think it was definitely a good response, and some people have then run it on other board and also used the code, like the minimal RISC-V modification that I made for Doom, and ported it to their own RISC-V and stuff like that. I think actually even recently a bloke by the name of FPGA Kai and ported it, I think, to his board too or something. I know he just supported MicroPython to it, which is another project that I also supported some time ago. Yeah.
Very cool.
I also ran Linux on the ICE42 actually.
I was going to say, I thought I remembered something about that, but
yes, that came later. That actually came again the same way. People were wondering, okay, can you run Linux on the ICE40? And, well, yeah, turns out you can.
You shouldn't dangle too much bait in front of you, because you'll go for it.
Yeah, exactly. And it actually was easier than I thought. I actually did the entire process on stream, and it took I think 4 streams to get it booting.
Very cool. Yeah. Well done. Presume it was sort of pretty difficult to use, but not very responsive kind of thing, or was it actually?
No, actually, it was actually surprisingly responsive. Like you can use Vim and the shell like normally, like you wouldn't.
Oh wow.
Yeah. No, it's
awesome.
It's actually surprisingly responsive. Of course, if you start running any application that uses CPU, it's gonna take time. But like the thing, it wasn't like a slideshow.
No.
You wouldn't know it. Yeah.
Awesome. Well done. Cool.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's talk about one of your other projects then, which is the an E1 USB interface. ICE1 USB.
The ICE1 USB. So the ICE1
with
USB
capital
is again,
E on ICE for E1.
Yeah. Exactly. So E1 is an old telecom interface kind of thing, like a primary line in ISDN, and Um, Hardwell at some point came up with the idea of like software-defined E1, which is basically doing a lot of implementing basically E1, but mostly in software or firmware rather than relying on dedicated chipsets.
Okay. Any particular reason for that?
So yeah, the reason why we needed E1 is because working a lot with telecom protocols and stuff like that, we wanted to reuse some no decommissioned and available to buy base station that use E1 as an interface to talk to them.
Okay.
And
we're talking about
the E1
cellular,
cards that we could find.
Cellular stuff here at the moment, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. All GSM stuff.
Okay.
All the E1 card that you could find at the time were basically older PCI cards, or sometimes modern ones were PCI Express, but it's just a PCI bridge and then the old PCI chipsets. Nowadays, you can find some native PCI E1, but you're looking at several €100 for the E1 interface, and then you need an actual, full PC that has PCIe or PCI slot or some adapters, stuff like that. So it was kind of inconvenient. And so we wanted to, do it in a more flexible manner and make it more accessible so that you can connect it to like a Raspberry Pi or connect it to like your laptop for like field testing, that kind of stuff. And so we settled on USB for the interface.
Okay.
And I started implementing that using the ICE40. And did it actually in some interesting way, because the original plan was to use something we called LIU, which is line interface unit, which sort of handles the analog side of the E1 signal, because it's not a CMOS signal, it's a some analog waveform basically. And usually you use those chips, and then those have the analog side, and then a few digital lines that provides you with like the raw bit stream and a clock basically.
Okay. Yeah.
And they do like clock recovery and that kind of stuff, but they don't do much more. The problem is those chips, a lot of them are becoming obsolete, especially now. And nowadays, like, they're impossible to find and they cost a fortune. Like, you pay €25 if you can buy it from Mauser, but they don't want to ship it to you before 2024.
Right.
And if you try to buy them from like some reseller, you're gonna pay like €50 for a chip. Like, that's not very convenient. And so something I ended up doing with the FPGA is actually driving it entirely using CMOS logic.
Okay.
So
is that quite a specialist front end you had designed up?
Yes.
For that then?
So for the transmit side, I ended up doing it's just 2 resistors.
Okay.
Basically, which generates
something
that is close enough for it to be working. The current pulse shape that's generated is too low in amplitude technically,
right?
But it's still within the
tolerance.
I mean, basically, if you connect it to a card that's as a compliant receiver, it will decode it correctly, because that pulse should be decoded correctly by a compliant receiver. What it won't do is that, E1 technically you can connect it to like 200 or kilometers of wires. You can't do that with the output of this thing, but that's not the target. We're not targeting long haul communication. We're targeting like desktop communication where the BTS is right next to the device. That's not much of an issue. For the receive side, what I ended up doing is some trickery with capacitors and resistors, and using the FPGA differential IOs as comparators to be able to detect which voltage level it is, because the E1 interface essentially has positive and negative pulse, and by setting appropriate threshold voltage and stuff like that, you can actually detect those pulse and then process that in the FPGA to recover timing and stuff like that.
Okay. Hope you don't mind. I'm just trying to grab up a PDF, see if we can have a look at this, because I'm in.
Yeah, sure. So if you, yeah, exactly, perfect. Yeah. So if you that's just the
on the left we've got the USB, and on the right we've got
the USB,
these two interfaces. Are these each of them is an E1 interface? Is it?
Exactly. There's two of them. And so if you scroll down, that's the main FPGA. That's okay. And this is the essentially the on the top you have the receive side. You have the two, like what's called RX bias P and RX bias N. These are the threshold voltage, basically, that are generated by a PWM, or technically a pulse density modulation code, which sets the threshold voltage for the positive and negative pulse detection. And then you have the RX pulse coming through the transformer, because you need galvanic insulation for E1, like in Ethernet. Then you have the 120 ohm termination resistor. And then it's basically capacitively coupled to lines that are maintained at two different bias voltages. And depending of if the pulse is positive or negative, one of the comparator or the other will be triggered. So if you have no comparator triggered, you know that you currently have 0 voltage on the line. If you have the positive comparator triggered, you know you have a positive pulse, and you have the negative one, you have a negative pulse. If you have both at the same time, you have a problem, because that should not happen.
Okay.
Yeah.
Very cool.
And then at the bottom, you have the transmit side, which is, as I said, really just two resistors to limit the current, and then the pulse transformer that galvanically isolate the.
Okay. And so these are actually, a pair for transmit, a pair for receiver, presumably, by the looks of it. And it just works nicely with your sort of simple, no IC, no PHY, as it were, but
exactly
does the job. Yeah. Awesome. Well done.
I'm actually in the process right now of testing because it's been working and everything, but I wanted, nobody asked me, but I wanted to dig into more of it, and I'm actually trying to test the compliance of them with the official specification for like sensitivity, crosstalk, impedance, and stuff like that, which is something I'm doing at the moment, and that hopefully I will present some in the near future when I actually have results. But
okay. But this product then, the USB, the ICE one, ICE one USB. I can't get my head around that.
Yeah.
I'll put a link again in the chat. But this is a product, you can buy it. Is that right?
Yes. So that's actually, so when I got finished developing that as kind of a prototype, I wanted because there was at least some interest for some people to buy it. I wanted to at least once go through the process of making an actual product that is sold, and that not just one board that I've assembled myself. And so I went through the process of first, picking an enclosure, picking a vendor for it, designing the actual final PCB to fit in that enclosure, trying to take into account things like the tolerance, because it has connectors on both sides. So you need
make the PCB too short, it will rattle about.
Yeah, exactly. The PCB can be too short, and when you buy like an aluminum enclosure from China, they have some tolerance in the thing. But if you have like even just 1 millimeter, your PCB can rattle inside or just not fit, or the connectors you can't connect it because it's too far in it, and or you can't insert your PCB at all because it's like
too wide.
It's like slightly too wide because the extrusion has slightly shrunk or is slightly bowed.
Okay.
And so trying to think about all that kind of stuff, and then also going to the process of I need to procure the parts, but I don't want to buy a full reel of ICE40, so that kind of stuff, and actually getting panels manufactured and assembled. Talking to an assembler, going through the quoting process, going through importing these things. And I had, thankfully, a lot of help and recommendation from Peter, again, from 1-Bit Squared. We recommended some assembler he had worked with for some of his product, even though he mostly does the assemble himself. Some of the things he used, in this case, it was a King Credit that I used for the PCB and assembly process and that kind of stuff. And so it was really a very interesting experience. I also underestimated like the time it takes to test those boards and assemble them in cases, because even though I tried to anticipate some of the things, one thing I completely overlooked is the fact that that board has a light pipe, and it's relatively long because it basically needs to go over the USB-C connector. And yeah, exactly. You see the light pipe is just above the USB-C connector. That means that the LED is actually behind the USB-C connector,
Right.
and there's a light pipe going, from one to the other. But then when you assemble the front panel, you actually that light pipe needs to be absolutely perfectly aligned, and the time it takes to put that front panel and align it correctly with the light pipe, it's annoying.
Interesting.
And if it takes like 30 seconds, you multiply 30 seconds to align the light pipe by 50 or 100 units, that start taking a lot of time just to put the front panel in.
Interesting.
So that's the kind of thing I'd like to,
Yeah. I see you've got an SMA connector in there as well. Is that
yes,
on a wire, or is that sort of part of the PCB? So it's more.
No, it's actually part of the PCB. Yeah, and it's there for like GPS synchronization, timing synchronization, basically, because since one of the requirements was talking to GSM BTS, and most GSM BTS will align their own internal oscillator to the recovered E1 clock, because and so we needed a very, very precise clock, because that's basically the clock master in the system.
I see. Okay.
Yeah.
Right. Very cool. And so, having gone through all of that process, was this sort of your first product procedure?
Yeah.
Taking
That
all the way
was
through.
my first product procedure. I ended up not handling the sales part, as I mean, if you've seen in the product page, Sysmocom is handling the actual stocking of the product and distribution of it, and they're actually handling the future manufacturing batch themselves. Because having it done once, I'm good.
I was going to say, is this you've done it once and you're not doing it again, kind of thing? Or
I'm not planning on doing it again. At least not for that. Like, but it was definitely a very interesting and full of learning experiences.
Okay, very cool. I think the last topic we've agreed on was GR Phosphor, which is a GNU radio plugin.
Yes. So GR Phosphor, I think, was the very first project that I did that had sort of a wider audience than a very niche thing, and also for which I actually cared about the users.
Right.
Because the thing is, I publish a lot of projects where I do them for me. I'm happy to publish them
and share them,
but I'm not necessarily gonna go through the trouble of trying to make them accessible or that kind of thing, because they're just like, I'm happy to share, but I don't have the resources to me spending a lot of time on making it all polished. And GR Phosphor was kind of the first different project where I actually cared if people used it, because I thought it was a good implementation and it was useful. So
so let's just back up a second. What is it and what does it do? Let's start there.
So GR Phosphor is basically GPU accelerated visualization of spectrum. So basically when you see spectrum, you basically do an FFT, right?
Okay, so we're talking about SDRs and RF.
Sorry. Yes, it's about software-defined radio. I sometimes forget the context.
No, that's okay.
In the context of software-defined radio, if you want to visualize the spectrum, you've got this nice trace that represents where the power is located versus frequency. And a lot of the time, it's just represented as a single line. Sometimes you average it or things like that. Now, the characteristic of GR Phosphor is that it actually draws a histogram of where the power is with sort of a decay, exactly like an old phosphor oscilloscope. Right? And the advantage is that, so basically where it's more intense, which is like the orange part there, that means that the FFT line has spent most of its time there, but you can still see the very, very short bursts in the lighter blue color. So you know that at some point at that frequency there was some power, like aligned with the -3, for instance, and that's very useful to see very short events, because the default kind of visualization that existed in GNU Radio and in also a lot of other software-defined radio applications. If you have very, very short bursts, like a few milliseconds or a few microseconds, you might miss them entirely because you will never see them. The characteristic of GR-fast score is that every single input sample from the SDR will end up on screen somehow.
Okay.
Which means that it's very, very hard to miss anything.
Yeah. So looking here, we've got, just to describe it for people who aren't necessarily watching, you've got a sort of red line along the top. That presumably is
that's the max
peak. So everything is underneath here. And then you've got from very dark blue, it's not quite black, all the way through sort of pale blue, green, up into the oranges. And what you're saying is that, anywhere that there's this pale blue is some signal has sort of sat there for the tiniest period. Yeah.
And so, for instance, like on the right side, you can see like that very typical shape of a Wi-Fi EPSK burst, from what I can tell. And the other like domes are probably Bluetooth.
Okay.
And you can see like they're very short in time, so like they're very pale blue because they were very intense. They were high power, so they went high in the power scale, but they were also very short, so they don't occupy a lot of the time.
Okay.
Yeah. And the idea from that is not new at all. It was originally implemented in a software called Strangelove, which later evolved into SDR Angel, which is now maintained by somebody else, but was originally written by Hopscotch in the Osmocomm IRC channel. And this implementation originally was targeting like RTL SDR, which is about 2 megas of bandwidth. And my laptop at the time just couldn't cope with that because that implementation was purely CPU based.
Right.
And it suddenly couldn't cope with like bandwidths like the B200, which can capture 20 megahertz or 40 megahertz of bandwidth. And so I figured, okay, maybe I can actually do better and implement that in the GPU of my graphic card. That's basically where GR-Fast 4 came from. Yeah.
So GPU accelerated. Was that a big thing for you? Was that something you'd worked with before?
No, it's the first GPU acceleration thing I did. Yeah. So I'm sure there's tons of beginner mistake in it or stuff like that, but it works good enough. I definitely want to come back to it because there's a bunch of improvement that I've planned. There's also a bunch of kind of rewrites that I've done, which I've never made it to like master because.
Okay.
Yeah, but yeah, definitely something I need to go back on.
Fantastic. And I'm right in thinking this is now shipped as part of the GNU Radio suite, as it were, or is this?
I think it's still a Node of 3 module, but you can just like in the so GNU Radio as it's packaged by some distribution, of course, and at least at some point I don't know if it's still the case, but it was packaged in even in the Windows version of GNU Radio, and then of course you can install it with so GNU Radio has sort of its own kind of package manager if you build things from source. The name eludes me at the moment, the name of that of the thing, but it's like the package description, it's included in that, so you can build it from there as well. The annoying part is that the GPU acceleration actually uses OpenCL there,
right?
Because it was written at the time before OpenGL Compute Shader existed. Which means that you need a GPU that actually supports OpenCL. It's not too much of a problem with NVIDIA cards. It works fine on AMD card, but it's a bit annoying to install, depending on which GPU you have. And kind of same for the Intel ones, which is always something that I found a little weird, is that the easiest card to get it working is NVIDIA, which is the one that technically is trying to bury OpenCL and push CUDA, and it's still the one where it's easiest to get it running. So yeah, whatever.
Oh, okay, interesting. Very cool. Thank you. So I've put a link for GR Phosphor in the chat as well, just in case anyone's interested. Yeah, I think we're sort of at about time and out of topics. Is there anything else you'd like to talk about or give any shout outs?
No. I mean, I think the only thing is, the link to like a bunch of the FPGA ICE4D project and other support is linking on GitHub. I mostly publish them under the NO2 FPGA banner, and there you will find, the core I wrote for E1, also an FPGA core for USB full speed. So you can implement any kind of USB devices in FPGA just using a couple of IOs. You'll find memory controller core for HyperRAM or for the SPI-PS RAM that I used in the Doom demo.
Okay.
So a lot of the reusable core end up there.
Yeah.
And these are actually projects that I like to support, which means that if you want to use them and you don't know how you want to integrate them, feel free to contact me. I'm on the 1-bit square Discord, and that's where you can find me the most the easiest and get some help on that.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you very much for joining us today. It's been fascinating to talk to you. Yeah. Thank you very much. As I said before, there's no shows for the next couple of weeks, but I think probably 10th of January I'll be back. So I look forward to seeing you all then. Hope you have good holidays. And thank you. Speak soon. Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.